In 1979, my father, a retired school principal, and I spent 5 days behind the Iron Curtain. We attended an educational symposium in West Berlin, then a divided Cold War city. Our agenda included a 1-day visit into East Berlin and later a 4-day visa adventure to the birthplace of my grandfather in the state of Mecklenburg in East Germany. Our symposium participants met at the European Academy in the Grunewald area of West Berlin, which was deep into what was then East Germany, or the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, a communist country, and it was not far from communist Poland. Our symposium was sponsored by Kent State University in Ohio and the European Academy in Berlin and the West German government. We met at the Academy in the Grunewald area of West Berlin, which was located in an upscale part of West Berlin, home to then consulates from countries all over the world. Grunewald encompassed the huge forest of the same name in Berlin and included a residential area of elegant villas and hotels. Let's start with some background on the post-World War II partition of Germany and the capital city of Berlin, and then I'll share our adventure behind the Iron Curtain. Berlin is located near the Polish border, deep in East Germany. At the end of World War II, large areas of German-speaking territories were attached to Poland and to the Soviet Union. The German areas in yellow were lost to Poland, and the areas in orange were lost to the Soviet Union. At the end of the war in Europe, Germany was divided by the Allied powers, the U.S., United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, into 4 sectors for administrative purposes and post-war recovery. Each of the 4 Allied powers was allocated a portion of Germany. Berlin, the historical capital of Germany, was similarly divided into 4 administrative areas. Since Berlin was located on the eastern edge of Germany near the Polish border, access lanes to the city were established by rail, highway, canal, and air corridors, ensuring western access to West Berlin. There were corridors for air traffic, roadways, barge canals, and rail lines between West Germany and West Berlin. The air corridors were 20 miles wide and below 10,000 feet. Each sector had its own airfield, and from 1945, the residents of Berlin could easily cross and recross borders in the city without much difficulty. The East German government, however, became uneasy about an Allied presence deep inside its borders, and at times would attempt to force the Allied military to leave Berlin. By late 1940s, the Soviet sector of Germany and East Berlin became a separate German country known as the German Democratic Republic, or DDR, and Berlin became East Berlin and West Berlin, a divided city. Then, in 1948, the East German government closed the borders, stopping access from West Germany to West Berlin. This cut off supplies to West Berlin and resulted in the Berlin airlift, with Western countries supplying essential goods by air for nearly 1 year. The East German government, along with their ally, the Soviet Union, wanted to drive out the West German control over West Berlin. Over 2.3 million tons of cargo were supplied by air, and at the end of the Berlin airlift, the East relented and reopened the borders to West Berlin. In September 1961, the DDR and Soviet Union cut off all access to West Berlin again. The communists pulled up train tracks and roads, erected barriers topped with barbed wire, completely isolating the western sectors in Berlin and preventing East Germans from escaping to the west. The Soviet Army moved 3 divisions closer to Berlin to discourage interference by the West and to assist in the event of large-scale riots. In August, the Soviets and the East Germans undertook a massive show of support in Berlin to stop the exodus of refugees to the West, in a direct response to Soviet and East German operations to cut off all access to Berlin. President Kennedy in the U.S. made a public show of ordering 148,000 National Guardsmen and reservists to active duty. I was a part of that call-up as a member of the 32nd Infantry Division, Wisconsin National Guard, one of many units called to active duty. Our division was deployed to Fort Lewis, Washington for nearly a year of training. After 5 months, access to West Berlin was once again restored by the USSR and the DDR, the Soviet Union, and East Germany. West Berlin was encircled by a wall and a wide, armed no-man's land. Fences and barricades and walls completely surrounded the 97 miles around the 3 western sectors of West Berlin and the 27 miles that cut through the heart of the city, dividing it. Here the wall passed by near Brandenburg Gate, entrance to historic Old Berlin. West Berlin became an island of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. This is what East Berliners saw on their maps. East German maps showed only white areas outside the borders of East Germany. And soon there were 116 towers watching that border. In 1979, our adventure into divided Berlin began in March of that year. Our group traveled into East Berlin one day of our week of seminar. When we crossed the border at the Friedrichstrasse station, we went through very tight security, lots of screening. We had a one-day visa, and we were required to be out of East Berlin by midnight. The trains in Berlin, strangely enough, ran across both East and West Berlin. Our seminar group of about 50 spent a day in East Berlin. We went to the Hall of Teachers for a lecture on the history of education in East Germany. In the afternoon, my father and I visited the East German Travel Agency, where we sought visas for a 3-day, 3-night visit to East Germany, where our German ancestors came from. At the Hall of Teachers, we learned that the communists took over shortly after the end of the Second World War, and all teachers were replaced with those who would conform to their communist doctrines. All of our time in East Berlin that day was spent in the area called Alexanderplatz, purported by the DDR as a showplace. Our efforts to obtain visas to visit outside of Berlin were granted, and our hope to visit our ancestors' home village became a reality. Near Alexanderplatz, we saw the Berlin Dome Cathedral. Badly damaged in World War II, it was being restored with massive donations from West German sources. It is located on the Museum Island on the Spree River in Old Berlin. The TV tower on the left was constructed in the late 60s by East Germany to be a symbol of communist power. However, West Berliners often saw a cross highlight in the reflection whenever they looked at it. Today, the Berlin Dome Cathedral is fully restored and a significant feature in Old Berlin. This is Museum Island in the Spree River in Old Berlin. Prior to leaving our seminar friends and the European Academy, we were advised by a U.S. State Department notification to send home all printed information that could be viewed as Western propaganda and not take pictures of roads, bridges, railroad stations, and the like. We then began our 4-day adventure into East Germany. But remember, to get our visas, we had to pay all 3 days lodging up front, 2 nights in Parchim near the Wunrow home village of Groß Neindorf, and 1 night in Schwerin, the capital of Mecklenburg. Our railroad station was underground, and we had a long wait, so I went outside and snooped around the neighborhood. Since my father was in his late 70s and only 3 years removed from open-heart bypass surgery, I suggested he remain in the station. The neighborhood was dingy and dirty. I was not impressed. The commonly seen car in East Berlin was a Trabant, a DDR car with inefficient 2-stroke engine, had poor economy for fuel, low power output, produced thick, smoky exhaust, and frequent production shortages. An East German cousin of mine bought one in the 1970s, we heard, and had to pay the total cost up front and wait for over a year for delivery. With our 4-day visa itinerary, we left East Berlin by rail for Parchim for 2 nights, then on to Schwerin, the capital city, for 1 night, and finally, 4 days later, to the East-West German border crossing, and finally to the West German city of Hamburg. Our railroad journey to Parchim was about 100 miles and included 1 transfer. We saw many people on the rail depot platforms, waiting patiently for the next train. Most were standing alone or in small pairs, but speaking in very quiet voices, giving us an eerie feeling. We also noted that nearly all the men were in uniform of one kind or another. This was March, and the weather was cold and rainy. Mecklenburg lies on the south shore of the Baltic Sea in the northern part of East Germany. The land is very flat, suitable for farming. Near Parchim, as our train slowed, we saw we were going through a Soviet military base. We saw military vehicles all marked with the traditional red star. And throughout our stay in Parchim, we saw visual reminders of the Soviet military presence in this city and in East Germany. We arrived in Parchim at dusk. It was raining and dreary. We missed one nearby taxi by just a few minutes. Wondering what next, we stood momentarily unsure of our next step. And then an elderly lady approached us. We quickly showed her the address of our lodging place, and she beckoned us to follow her to a bus ticket machine, and she bought 3 tickets. We boarded the bus together with all of our bags or luggage, and near the city center, now dark, we left the bus and followed her several blocks, passing the police station. Near a closed, war-damaged church, she stopped and pointed to a storefront ahead of us, our hotel address. We thanked her, and I reached into my pocket for a small stash of Kennedy $50 and gave one to her. She was a godsend, to us an angel to follow to safety. We left our angel lady and approached our inn, our home for the next 2 days. We cautiously approached the dark doorway and opened it. Inside, the hallway was also dark, and then we saw light coming from under a door nearby, and we slowly opened the door and entered a smoke-filled beer hall filled with people. Searching for a desk of some kind, we made our way to the back of the room where we met a man and a woman behind a low bar, hopefully the owners. I showed our reservation, and the man acknowledged it with a smile, and we breathed a huge sigh of relief. Seated at a large table with others, we soon were dining on a plate of schnitzel and fries. and a welcome glass of beer. My dad quickly began to chat with his new table mates, using the limited German of his childhood. Our evening continued like this for several hours, our sense of comfort increasing. Hours later, we eased out of the bar and up a steep stairway to our tiny rooms, and sleep soon overtook us. The next morning, I stepped outside to a bright and sunny day. Then, looking down the street, I saw 2 Soviet Army MPs, a stark reminder of where I was. I dared to take a photo knowing it was against the law we were advised to follow. This same taxi we had seen the night before parked in front of the police station. Soon we were approaching the ancestral village of my grandfather and my father's father, Gustav Wunrow. He and his family had left this place in 1883 for America. Gross Neindorf was a poor village with a muddy main street. There was no commercial area, only brick houses, a small community building, and a pond. Now we had to face the reality that all of our preparation had focused on our getting there and not what to do upon arrival. A major language barrier also. And so we proceeded to stumble with simple words and lots of gestures. We asked our driver about a church, but there wasn't one. But he directed us to a lady who served as a church representative in this village. The nearest churches were in Preston-Wamchow, according to church records. Before World War II, areas like this one were often parts of large estates, and most farmers worked for the estate owner or rented farmland. This had been the landowner's manor house in Gross Niendorf in the early 1900s, common in northeastern Germany's past. We further inquired about any Wunrow people who might have lived here in recent years, and we were taken to a house previously owned by a Wunrow until 1960 when the Berlin Wall was erected. The Wunrow spelling is a common variation of our spelling. This house is typical of homes in Gross Niendorf. Notice that the near 1/3 of the house was an animal barn, likely for horses. Their farm fields were in the area around the village. They didn't live on their farmland, unlike farmers in the USA. My proud father was now standing in his father's home village. Here is our taxi driver. He was pretty helpful to us, but who likely also reported directly to the police wherever necessary, a common practice in the DDR in those days. We were shown the house of the most recent ancestor who had left for the West in 1961, when the wall was constructed, and it was now occupied by a widow, and she welcomed us to enter her home. Here's the inside of the widow's home, the interior. We wondered if some of these possessions from the past might have been from a previous resident, maybe a Wunrow or Wunrow ancestor. We asked about a village cemetery and were led to a cove of trees on the edge of town. All the burial markers were from recent years, and each grave was covered with pine boughs. We learned later that graves were often leased for up to 20 years and then reused. After a couple of hours, we headed back to Parchim. Along the route, we saw large piles of seed potatoes ready for spring planting. Later that evening, we ate dinner in the beer hall. Our hosts had offered to make dinner and other meals for us, even though they didn't serve food to the others in the hall. I struck up a conversation, even though our language limits were many, with a fellow my age the night before, and he returned this evening to see us again despite a pouring rain. He seemed especially hungry for a connection to the West. It's likely Westerners were not common in this remote city in East Germany. Our bus ride to Schwerin was uneventful, but quite crowded. Schwerin is in the far northwest part of East Germany, and not far from the border to the west. The tallest of all churches in Mecklenburg is a masterpiece of Northern Gothic architecture. It's the oldest surviving building of the old city of Schwerin. It's the highest church tower in Mecklenburg and measures 385 feet in height. It was built in the 19th century. Since there was neither a stone quarry or any other natural source of building stones near Schwerin, the cathedral was nearly entirely built of bricks. It was to become one of the most impressive examples of the Northern European architectural style called brick Gothic. The nave of the church is 340 feet long, and the arches reach up to 87 feet. After checking into our hotel and handing over our passports, we looked for the church and its pastor and were directed to this office, the pastor's office. We were seeking church archives to research for our ancestors. Pastor Pilgrim was available, and he gave us a tour of the cathedral. We then asked about church records, and he directed us to an upper room where a number of people were researching family records for customers. We worked for about an hour with a researcher who was very helpful in identifying our Wunrow ancestors. Interestingly, we later learned that the church district in 1979 for this area extended on both sides of the border with West Germany. That is, some parishes were in East Germany and some were in West Germany. The cathedral altar was old and ornate, featuring a Gothic winged altar with central sandstone relief of the crucifixion. Pastor Pilgrim told us it dated to the Middle Ages. Schwerin Cathedral is one of the churches where you can see tombs and coffins of the Grand Duchy royal family of Mecklenburg province. For example, we saw the grave of Grand Duke Frederick Franz II, who built the castle. Under the East German regime, church-going is greatly discouraged and has declined significantly since the late 40s when the communists took over East Germany. The Schwerin Castle was the home of the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg in the days before Germany was reunified in 1870 and 71, following the Franco-Prussian War. In 1979, the castle was the home of a technical school during the East German period of 1945 to 1989. Since German reunification, the castle has been completely restored and is a showplace in the area. In 1979, while walking in the city center, we noticed untended babies in buggies outside of stores, many of them. It appears a common practice that babies in prams or buggies were left outside stores while the mother had a brief errand in the store. From our hotel window, we could see the railroad station, or Bahnhof. Our train would take us from Schwerin to Hamburg across northern Germany and across the Iron Curtain to the west. About halfway to Hamburg, our train slowed and then crawled along for several miles before stopping. There were barbed wire fences on both sides of the track for these last few miles. We were at the border between East Germany, the DDR, and West Germany. Once we had stopped, we noticed many uniformed people coming toward our train, and each railroad car was entered, and amid lots of shouting, a female border guard slid open our compartment door. The female border guard demanded our identification. My dad and I were the only ones in our compartment. She stood in the doorway and carefully examined our passport photo, one glance at a time, alternately looking up at us and then at the photo. It seemed to take an eternity, and we felt threatened and uneasy while this was going on. Finally, she ordered us to get up and stand in the outer corridor while she looked over our bags and luggage. She checked under the seats as well, and at one point she picked up my carry-on, where I had scattered some coins in the bottom. She dumped out the contents, and she picked up the loose coins. And then she opened the car window and called loudly, "Cross, cross," whereupon another person came running up with a large container labeled DDR Red Cross. We were now reluctantly contributing our miscellaneous collection of DDR coins to the East German Red Cross. Apparently, it was unlawful to take DDR money out of the country. Eventually, our uninvited visitor turned and left our compartment. Throughout this episode, there were lots of shouting in other cars, a lot of intimidation, and after what seemed like a very long time, the noises finally diminished. The train began moving slowly forward, and then once more slowed to a stop after a few minutes. Again, small buildings bordered the track, and again, people emerged and came running toward our cars. But this time, uniforms didn't dominate, and each person carried a tray with coffee, fruit, and bakery. We were being welcomed back into the free West Germany area. No more intimidation, no more threats. It was time to feel safe again. We spent 2 nights in Hamburg before flying home. We took a harbor tour since Hamburg is a major seaport, and we also rented a car and drove to Ratzeburg, about an hour away, to visit another church that was a repository also of Mecklenburg church records. But this church was in the west, and its records were duplicates of those in Schwerin in the east. Someone in the early post-war period had the foresight to protect these old church records before the Iron Curtain and the wall became a part of life. My dad lived until 1991. He was 90 years old. He frequently spoke passionately about his adventures in East and West Berlin, East Germany, the DDR, and above all, the home village of his father, Gustav, Gross Neindorf, and I was privileged to be a part of it all. He was 79 in 1979 and a recent heart bypass survivor. And my dear mother was so happy to see her husband once more, something she wasn't sure of when we had left home 2 weeks earlier.